tensions rise in West Asia as Indian-flagged ships face uncertainty near the Strait of Hormuz. At least 37 Indian ships carrying 1,109 crew members are currently stuck in the Persian Gulf and Gulf of Oman. Some vessels are waiting to load while others are fully laden. The Indian National Shipowners Association has confirmed the situation and urged the government to step in. In a statement, the INSA said these vessels are on both sides of the Hormuz Straits. Indian ships have Indian seafarers on board. We request the government of India to ensure safe passage, protecting Indian lives, assets and national supply chains. Officials are monitoring the situation closely as the US-Israel-Iran tension continues to escalate. Now, viewers, the tensions are continuously escalating and tensions rise in West Asia as the Indian flag ships face uncertainty near the Strait of Hormuz. At least 37 Indian ships carry 1,109 crew members are currently stuck in the Persian Gulf and Gulf of Oman, and some vessels are waiting to load while the others are fully laden. Now, the Indian National Shipowners Association has confirmed the situation and urged the government to step in. Well, viewers, I'm being joined by Karthik Malhotra, the executive editor of News 9. Karthik, thank you so much. Karthik, the current situation is continuously escalating now. The Indian Ship Association writing a letter to the Indian government to intervene, asking them that the Indian government should make sure that the safe passage and also the safety of the Indian seafarers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the situation in West Asia is volatile to say the least. And there are mixed signals which are coming because Iran is steadfast in its belief that the Strait of Hormuz will be closed for as long as it takes. And any ship trying to cross that passage is going to be dealt with a military attack. Meanwhile, US President Donald Trump has said that the US administration is going to try and secure the Strait of Hormuz, also suggesting some plans that perhaps civilian ships will be escorted by US vessels to protect the safety of those civilian ships passing through the region. But right now, the Strait of Hormuz is obviously a contentious issue. But do remember that it is the Strait of Hormuz which is pretty much, the only route which caters to almost half of India's own energy needs. So while there is a humanitarian problem with these 37 ships stuck somewhere between the Gulf of Persia, the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman, unable to reach the Strait of Hormuz, this is also an economic challenge where how does India secure about 50% of its energy needs, both oil and gas, which pass through that region? Now, I've been told that out of those 37 ships, a bulk of those ships are in fact already loaded with the liquefied natural gas, the LNG supplies, which are to come to India. Now, of course, there is a longer option available if these ships were to turn around and go back all the way to Red Sea and then come back via the Cape of Good Hope. But then that obviously increases the amount of time as well as the cost of the freight coming into India. On the Indian ports also, Sabya, there's a challenge, and the challenge there is that as many as 1,000 ships are stuck right now at Indian ports, creating a choke point of its own, because they are unable to proceed, not knowing which route they should take to take supplies to the rest of the world. So our exports also pretty much right now stuck at our own ports. Now, of course, you are talking about the Indian National Shipping Association, which has written to the government. The government has also said that it is talking to, all players involved, including the international water alliances, and trying to figure out a safe passage for Indian ships. But until there is clarity, unfortunately, these ships will either have to be stranded or they'll have to take that safer but longer route of turning around and coming via the Red Sea, via the Cape of Good Hope, which of course is going to add to costs, but obviously is going to be a safer option.
Well, Karthik, how are the Indian markets reacting to this escalating West Asia situation right now?
So, again, it's been a mixed bag. And, I started off by answering your previous question with the term volatility, and that's pretty much the nature of the Indian markets also right now. So, overall in markets today, we did see some sort of a bounce back in early trade, but not surprisingly, it was energy stocks which were actually going through the roof and in fact doing much better than the broad index. So, you had Reliance stock up about 3% or so in early trade this morning. You also had stocks of HPCL, BPCL, IOCL, ONGC, Coal India, all energy companies were doing much better than the last 5 days have seen, and that comes on account of two assurances. One assurance being the fact that the US administration stating that it is going to secure the Strait of Hormuz, which means supply chain is going to resume, although we haven't really heard any confirmation from the Iranian side of any cessation of hostilities on the Strait of Hormuz. The other good news for the Indian energy producers was the fact that Russia has offered as much as 9.5 million barrels of oil which can be shipped to India when required. So overall, that somber mood of supply chain constraints was partly lifted, at least in sentiment, in the market this morning when these two news items acted as a trigger for people to believe that the energy crisis may not really be knocking at our door just as yet. But again, there are enough vessels stuck without really, a palatable solution of whether they should go ahead across the Strait of Hormuz, obviously risking the lives and risking the cargo which is on board those ships, or incur those higher costs and take the longer route and come to India at a time, like I mentioned, where Indian ports already have a choke point of vessels already stuck waiting to depart, not knowing which route they want to take as far as India's exports are concerned.
Well, Karthik, what options currently does the government of India has? And also, one more question that I would like to ask you, that could India be forced to diversify its oil imports away from the Gulf more aggressively?
Yeah, so I think, two parts to that question. Let me take the second part first. The second part really is about diversification, and that is linked to the first question about what are the options India has. Well, in fact, India and China were among the only two large economies which had diversified their sources of procuring energy outside of the West Asian countries. And that is what led to India and China both buying loads of Russian oil at a time when the Russian oil was discounted. Right now, remember, the Russian oil is neither discounted and it's also frowned upon by the US administration. So if India wants to increase its take of Russian crude oil imports, that is not something that the US is likely to appreciate. So India will have to sort of, balance that fine line tread very carefully in trying and sort of, ensuring that there is enough availability and affordability of its own energy needs, and at the same time figure out, how best to sort of avoid the ire of the US, which has been pressurizing India, not as much China, to stop buying Russian oil. Russia at the same time pretty much criticizing US's end goal and its stated objectives of the war in the Middle East, and saying that it is willing to do business with India, and as much as almost 10 million barrels of oil can reach India when required. So I think India will have to continue to diversify, no doubt about that. But even if you diversify, at the end of the day, there are contracts which are in place, and what happens to those contracts, and that becomes a larger issue for India to sort of, over time go into. And more importantly, what happens to containers already in the Persian Gulf and in the Gulf of Oman, which are carrying energy which India has bought to reach India. So I think answering the first part of your question, what are the options India has? I think India will have to take a little bit of beating on its chin as far as prices go. But do remember, India also has a lot of cushion, because when oil prices came down to almost $50 a barrel levels, we did not really cut the pump cost of petrol and diesel, which means for more than a year, our oil marketing companies have continued to profit excessively from the low oil cost, which they should now be able to utilize to keep prices stable, even if overall energy prices continue to climb. Yesterday, Brent was trading at about $83 a barrel. Some estimates, pessimistic estimates, though, also state that oil could reach as much as $120 a barrel. So I think overall it just boils down to, is this going to be a short-lived war, just a few weeks, or is it going to be a prolonged one? Because if it manages to end in, let's say, 4 to 5 weeks, which was the assumption earlier, then India has enough oil and enough gas to sort of not get the country in any sort of an energy crisis or bordering an energy crisis. But if this happens to be a prolonged war, let's say 3 months, 6 months or beyond, then of course India will have to more seriously consider its energy basket options.